Podcast 411, Item 228. Today's guest is Mike Duncan from the Revolutions and the History of Rome podcasts.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 podcast. In this episode, we have an interview with Mike Duncan, and then after the interview, I get into some podcasting news. There's a new version of GarageBand out and what that means for some podcasters. The Poscast app has been updated for iOS. My thoughts on the LA Podcast Festival, the upcoming New Media Expo show in Las Vegas, and some other tips, news, and more for podcasters. Again, all after the interview. As always, your feedback is greatly appreciated. Give us a call, 206-666-4357. That's 206-MOM-HELP. Or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. One correction from the last show, and that is at the end, I mentioned the great DragonCon panel about how to start a fan cast and mistakenly said that was from Kevin Crossman, when I meant to say it was from Kevin Batchelder from the Tuning Into Sci-Fi podcast. That's what I get for not scripting that part of the show. Kevin, my apologies. And now on to the interview with Mike Duncan. Here we go. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
First question I always ask is, what was your first computer?
My first computer, well, the family computer was an Apple IIe.
Ah, okay. So what are you on now?
Right, I have actually I'm on a MacBook Pro that I just bought about 3 weeks ago.
Uh-oh, because you know there's going to be new MacBook Pros announced tomorrow.
No, I did not know that.
Yes.
Are you serious?
Yes.
That is okay. I purchase my products when I need them. Mm-hmm. So the old MacBook got me through 5 years, but finally started to die. And with the new show, it wasn't hacking it anymore. So I just needed to pull the trigger and get a new computer.
We'll get into your shows in a sec. Well, you know what? I'll get into it right now. You do two shows, or I should say, you are doing your second show, and you've completed your first show. Tell the listeners a little bit about the new show, and then we'll get into the old show too.
Okay, so the new show is Revolutions, and I am taking 8 or 9, depending on what I want the final list to be, sort of the great political revolutions in history. So I'm starting with the English, then we're going to do the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and each one will run for 12 to 15 episodes, although already the English Revolution is getting away from me episode-wise.
Well, so kind of like the whole revolution got away from Charles.
Yeah. We've gotten into the war, and suddenly I'm not as far along as I thought I was going to be, but I don't want to sort of truncate the story too much because it's really, really good story. So we'll see how long it actually takes me to get through this. But that's the idea behind this show.
Now, I've listened to all of the episodes on revolutions, and I was amazed where you're at, how incompetent they seem to be on the British military at that point in time, where 100 years later, they're like all of a sudden the most competent military.
Yeah, well, and also then, I mean, the British with their Navy is really where they start to dominate. And that comes out of this period, right? Because the English, because they were an island, they didn't really need to have a standing army the same way that the various continental powers did. And then the policy of the Stuarts for like 30 or 40 years before the revolution breaks out is to really not get involved in the 30 Years' War. I mean, this is all happening at the same time as the 30 Years' War. So they're trying to stay out of that. So some of the officers had served on the continent as volunteers, but a lot of the rest of them, you know, this is like their first experience with big military campaigns. And yeah, there's some blundering going along. That's really, I mean, comparing it to studying the Romans for so long, you know, it's ridiculous to see what some of these cavalry detachments are doing. I'm like, 2,000 years ago, you would have gotten whipped by the Numidians. So,
yeah, I was going to say, your other show, which many people may know of, which the first one was the History of Rome, which you ran out of history of.
Yeah, I cut it off.
and there was 179 episodes, folks, and please, if you haven't listened to that series, go back and listen to it. Great series.
It's, you know, actually, I have to say this because in the early stages, I was doing like episode 3A and 3B. So there's actually 189 episodes.
And I should say, early on, too, your audio quality was not where it's at today. So you've changed your equipment. And, this is a show about podcasting. We'll talk about that too. I mean, what did you do early on?
And see how much I want to go George Lucas on those early episodes.
Yeah, I mean, but what did you do early on recording, and then what are you doing today?
Oh, okay. So those early episodes was just me with the, just the Mac, my now wife's Mac. And I was just using the internal mic, right, that was built into it. I was just recording in a room. Yeah, I didn't even have a microphone. And I went through that for like 10 episodes, and I was like, this is ridiculous. I sound like I'm in a cave. So then I plugged in a microphone.
And what are you using today for your microphone?
Right now I'm still on my old blue Snowball mic, USB mic.
It sounds very good. I mean, the Revolutions ones, and obviously in the later part of most of the History of Rome podcasts sound fine.
Yeah, I think it sort of works itself out mostly by episode 10 or 15, and then it changes again along the way. But yeah, that early stuff, I actually am planning on going back and re-recording the early episodes. I want to do that.
So this episode, I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit here. Normally I put the tech at the end and the story in the front, but now I want to go back to the story, though. So having done the history of Rome and, dealing with people that are really well-versed in military, and then also now you're doing this Charles here, were you surprised when you were doing the research how incompetent they were militarily?
Yeah, I was. Because like you said, it's the British, and the British have a very good reputation historically for their military commanders, for their naval commanders. This is just it's kind of a unique little period in time where they're the gang who couldn't shoot straight, but that only goes, I don't know, until 1644 or 1645. Once they've all had 2 or 3 years under their belt, and once the new model army shows up, you start to see a lot more professional behavior from everyone. Although Rupert still, Prince Rupert, we'll get to him, will still blow the Battle of Naseby because he rides off and chases the opposing cavalry instead of just wheeling around and trying to win the battle.
Was that was already one of the episodes where he?
Yeah, well, that happened at Edgehill, and then it happens again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you think the guy would have learned, but he was 24 years old. He was, I guess he just gets carried away.
What is it that got you into doing history podcasts?
Well, I'm just an enormous history buff. That's pretty much all that I read, all that I had been reading, before I started doing the history of Rome. So when I think of sort of any creative project that I had wanted to do, usually it's linked to history in some way. And the history of Rome was really just another sort of project that I started that just happened to keep going for 5 years. But yeah, it's really just sort of an innate love for history more than anything else.
Now, the history of Rome, it ended in May of 2012 was when you put the last episode up. You're still getting over 500,000 downloads a month for those episodes. It's amazing. And so there's a lot. I mean, when people ask me what do people listen to? It's comedy and then education. And I put history in education. Yeah. It seems people really love the history stuff. I know I do. I mean, it used to be you could watch a history channel and actually get history. Now it's ice truckers. Yep. So it seems like
that's true. I was so excited when the History Channel came out, and I was addicted to it. And then it just slowly, sort of hour block by hour block, so really turned into another reality TV vehicle.
So now it's really down to you and Dan Carlin. If you want a history fix, that's where folks have to go.
Yeah, well, there's other stuff that's floating around out there. There's a couple of good English history podcasts. A friend of mine just finished The Ancient World, which goes sort of all the stuff that's previous to Rome, which was, I think, really good.
Which series was that one?
It's The Ancient World.
The Ancient World, okay.
Yeah, by Scott Chesworth. Which was actually, maybe I'll tell this story, is that I was actually thinking of doing that as a follow-up to the history of Rome, focusing on those early civilizations. And I knew Scott. He came on one of the tours, and we were talking about it one night at dinner. And I said, they were asking me what might you do after the history of Rome, and I said, maybe I'll do some of the ancient civilizations. And he just got this look on his face because he was like, I was planning on doing that.
Oh, dibs.
Yeah. So I gave him. I said, if you do it 1 year, you have 1 year, and if you don't do it, then it's fair game. But then he did it, and it's great. And he just finished it.
Okay. What made you settle in on Revolutions?
So I wanted to do something that was still like world history, because I had all these History of Rome listeners and I didn't want to just immediately turn around and do something really like parochially American to sort of make it easy to transition to the next show. But then I also didn't want to do ancient history again, because I didn't want to just lock myself into being, the guy who does podcasts about antiquity. And then when I was growing up, I guess maybe in high school, sort of probably my two favorite time periods, this is before I got actually super into the Romans, was the American Revolution. And then weirdly, the Russian Revolution I was really into when I was like 14, 15, 16 years old. So these sort of tumultuous moments have always been something that's near and dear to me. And then just like one day before the end of the History of Rome, maybe in like February, March, sort of leading up to the end of it, like the idea just clicked in my head. And that was it. That was what I was going to do.
The revolutions that you're going to be covering, are you going to go chronologically? So you're starting here in the 1640s and you're going to work your way up in time?
Yeah. So it's starting 1640s. So the next one will be the American Revolution, then the French Revolution. And then I'm going to do the Haitian Revolution after that. And then it'll skip forward a bit because really, like, as revolutionary as the 19th century sort of is in our minds, like with the rise of Marx and sort of worker revolts, you don't really get into the next round of really good political revolts until the Russians and the Chinese and I'm going to do the Mexican Revolution. So it'll end sometime in the 20th century. Right now it's ending with Cuba, but I might not be able to resist Iran.
I was going to ask if you were going to do the Spring Uprising.
No, not these most recent ones. This is way too current events to really look back on.
So you're talking about, okay, so basically you're going to end in the 70s with Iran.
Yeah, okay. Or Cuba. When I was making the original list, I sort of pushed it all the way to the collapse of the USSR and sort of all the stuff that surrounded that. But I don't think I'm going to do that.
It'll be a couple years from now by the time you get there.
Yeah, it'll be. Yeah, I plotted. I just set myself on a 3-year mission.
Well, I am glad that you are back podcasting. Were you hearing from a lot of the listeners during your down period? I know Audible was always bugging me as, when's Mike coming back? But were you hearing from your listeners about, hey, are you doing when are you coming out with a new show? Or what was the feedback when you put out episode 179?
I was getting emails from people, but it was mostly just, I look forward to your next show. Can't wait till you do it. But given that I had put 5 years into it, I think people were mentally ready to give me a year before I had to come back. I think there was a happenstance just in my life where it was probably going to have been 2 years before I was able to come back, but just happenstance landed it that I could come back earlier than that. I think if I had waited 2 years, probably by like 18 months, 19 months, then I would have started to getting like sort of irate emails. Like, dude, come on, like, come back. Do the next show. I'm tired of waiting. But I think a year was good because it gave everybody. I think people were ready to give me a break.
Yeah, I was happy to see that episode come up on the feed saying that you were getting ready to come back. So it was nice.
Yeah, that was definitely throwing my hat over the fence. I was like, okay, I want to do it. I'm going to come back. So I'll announce it, right, and then I'll have to do it. I won't be able to just be like, oh yeah, I'll get to it. Yeah, as soon as I announced it, that forced me to do it, which is good. I work way better with a deadline.
Researching for the first revolution, Charles, why did you choose on that one to start with?
How did I eventually settle on the English Revolution? Mostly it's because at this point we're moving out of the Middle Ages. And so there's the quote unquote modern revolutions or early modern revolutions that I want to be talking about, sort of the big ones of those, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. What is building up to that is the experience of the English in the 17th century. So you have the Glorious Revolution, which I'm going to get to sort of as a postscript, which some people would say, I think somebody actually just wrote a book, I forget what his name was, that was the first modern revolution, was the Glorious Revolution. But to understand the Glorious Revolution, you need to understand everything that happened in the 1640s. And then you sort of go back before that, and the next really big revolution that would have preceded the English Revolution was the Dutch Revolt against the Spanish, which you could argue was the first major sort of war of independence in a modern sense. But that covers like 80 years, the Dutch Revolt does. So that was too much for what I was trying to do with like these capsules in time. So I was like, okay, well, I don't want to do the Dutch. So I guess the next thing coming back the other way would be sort of everything that happened in the 1640s and 1650s. I was like, well, this is good. They overthrow the king. They abolish the monarchy. They declare a republic. This is all very inspiring to the founding fathers. So let's do,
And by the way, those would be spoiler alerts for those that aren't up on their history.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Because, the guy like Jefferson and Anna, I was just reading about this, that the Battle of Worcester, which ends the Third Civil War in the 1650s, that's really the beginning of the Cromwell's reign. 100 years later, Jefferson and Adams walked the battlefield and were discussing how this was the birthplace of democracy, the birthplace of republicanism was here at Worcester.
It's kind of funny that the British go through this and they don't even realize that that's what the Americans want anyway later on. But
yeah, it's all very funny that in the next series will be basically Parliament trying to impose its will on somebody who's basically making the same arguments that Parliament made in the 1640s.
I've been listening to the series as you've released it, and some of the episodes where it's funny, you hear Charles not getting along with Parliament and how almost like gridlocked. And I was just thinking at the same time we had the government shut down, and I was thinking, well, some things never change.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
History has a tendency to repeat itself. Let's hope we don't get into a civil war here.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Now, luckily, the government's back here working again. Well, I don't say that. Yeah. They're back.
Who knows what is going on?
Let's talk about more fun subjects. What are you using to edit your podcast? What software? Are you GarageBand or are you using something else?
Yeah, I'm using GarageBand because, again, when I started, I was just like, oh, my wife has bought a fancy Mac. I wonder what I can do with it. And it had GarageBand, so I used it. With the new MacBook, I'm on a newer version of of GarageBand.
Did that take a little bit of time getting used to?
Well, the commands are all the same, but they've inserted some functionality to it, which is just awful.
You got to get rid of that podcast track. You got to delete that right out first.
Yeah, but it's actually been sort of underwhelming. So I might wind up exploring other recording software, but I've kind of got it right now. And I don't do a ton of editing after the fact. I try to just record it, and then as I go, if I make mistakes, I'll just go back and sort of re-record stuff instead of trying to go in and taking out ums and ahs, and if I flub, trying to stitch it together after the fact. So I don't actually do a ton of editing after the fact.
I take it you script ahead of time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
So how long does it take you to record about 20, but your episodes are in the 25 to 30 minute, 25 minute range roughly. How long does it take you to record your episodes?
In the heyday of the history of Rome, I could record in an hour. These days, it's taken me like an hour and a half.
Getting back,
but I'll get back into it.
And I should point out, if we're talking about GarageBand here, it's October 21st when we're recording this. It's a day before Apple announces whatever they're going to announce. So they may announce a new version of GarageBand tomorrow on the 22nd. We'll see.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see how well that works. Well, hopefully they do. GarageBand is well overdue for an update.
Yeah. So now I'll just get to constantly be inundated with update requests.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not too bad. You just have to. Hopefully, it'll be just one quick update, and you'll get back to that hour-long recording session for 20 minutes.
Oh well, it taking an hour is just because I can't make my mouth work right.
Oh, I'm just
flubbing over things, and I can't. It's all right there on the page. Why can't I just read it?
And you're dealing with names too.
Yeah.
What was it? What was the one? Was it Saint? It was supposed to be Saint James. It was
St. John. Yeah,
St. John. Yeah, St. John.
Yeah, that one scared the bejesus out of me because I was starting to feel like I was getting a handle on English pronunciation, and I'm still going to flub stuff along the way. But I explored most of the pitfalls that are out there that most people fall into, and then just really by happenstance noticed that Oliver St. John was pronounced Oliver St. John, and I was just like, oh God, I know nothing, and I'm about to start recording this thing.
That was one of my questions. How did you even find out that his name was supposed to be pronounced St. John instead of St. John?
I came across a Wikipedia article that was quite helpful, which is entitled Counterintuitive English Pronunciation. Right, and it's just a list of all of the words, British English that are pronounced counterintuitively, and St. John was on that list. And I was like, what? How can St. John possibly be on this list? And then I looked at it and was like, yeah, actually it's pronounced Oliver St. John, and I was just, oh God. But, at least I caught it.
It's not nearly as confusing as trying to follow people whose names change.
Yeah.
And you always have nice little snarky comments there. Okay, now we're going to change this person's name to this name.
Yeah, that's another thing that I didn't, having really dug into this, is I used to make jokes about how unfair it was to history students that Octavian suddenly becomes Augustus, right? In like around 27 BC, in all the history books, you're learning about this guy Octavian, and then you skip ahead a little bit, and suddenly this guy Augustus is doing stuff, and it's. I was like, oh, it must be so confusing for like newcomers to this, only to find that when you get into English history, like everybody's name is changing like every 4 chapters. Like who was it? Manchester, right? So Manchester, who is one of the main generals, right? He was Lord Mandeville until he becomes Manchester in 1642. And I was sort of bouncing around between books, and it took me, I think I was like a month into it before I discovered that like the Earl of Manchester and Lord Mandeville were the same person.
You almost have to have like a big whiteboard on the wall where you have like strings and little Post-it notes and tying together people's names.
You got to know suddenly when everybody's dad died. Like I don't just have to know about them, but I have to know when their fathers died, because then their names change, or when they did something particularly nice for the king and he makes them,
Well, at least when you get into the American Revolution, the names pretty much stay the same.
Yeah, the names are going to stay the same, aren't they?
I think that's the one nice thing about the U.S.'s system was, or American system was, they wanted to get away from that whole British hierarchy. Everything goes to your oldest son.
Right. They did. Yeah, that was all that primogeniture stuff, and then that'll give me a nice reprieve before I try to mangle French.
I do not envy you on the French.
Yeah, I've got a strategy sort of lined up for how to deal with the French stuff.
Of course, when you get to the Russian ones, I'm sure that's not going to be any easier either.
Nope. It's all very scary.
History Room was very, very popular podcast. Any mainstream coverage that surprised you that you were able to get out of that?
It got written up in BBC's Knowledge magazine, which was pretty cool. And the thing that was actually the best about that was that my dad has a subscription to BBC Knowledge magazine. So I think he was like sitting in an airport reading it, waiting for a flight. And he's just sort of, let's look at the podcast stuff. And the history of Rome was written up. So that was pretty cool.
And wife very proud of you getting that write-up as well?
Oh, sure. Yes, she's very proud of me.
It's always nice when the spouse gets to see some stuff like that.
Yeah, and she's always, she's the one who keeps me super honest about everything. Because when the show first launched, and it was just this little thing that I was doing, who knows what's going to come of it. And I think when I had like 100 subscribers, I was very excited about having these 100 subscribers. I couldn't believe that 100 people out there wanted to listen to what I had to say about Roman history. And so now that I have, tens of thousands, or, we've had millions of downloads, like anytime I start getting nonchalant, like, oh yeah, I had 1 million downloads. She's like, do you remember how excited you were when you had 100? Just remember that always. So she's the one whispering in my ear. Remember, all glory is fleeting.
Is there any other podcasts that you listen to even occasionally?
Occasionally, I will listen to, because, I don't have a ton of time, what with the fact that I have to produce my own show, is Joe Posnanski, when he does a podcast, or he occasionally does his show. Right. But usually when it's when Michael Schur is on there as a guest, I will make sure to listen to those. That's well worth an hour of my time.
Well, small world, because Joe and I are actually friends, and Margot, his wife, and I, and my wife, and I had to convince Joe to start podcasting way back when. Get
out of town. You are friends with Joe Posnanski.
Yes.
That is ridiculous.
I've knew Joe.
That is the only show that I will listen to.
Yeah, no, I've known Joe for a really long time, because he used to be here in Kansas City.
Yeah. So you're in Kansas City. Yeah, sure.
Yep. I was at his wedding, and my wife was in his wedding party. So
you're blowing my mind right now.
No, so we're friends with them, and it's just funny that you mentioned Joe. But he's a great guy. But I had to twist his arm to get him to do a podcast. I was like, Joe, you got to be doing it. You got all these books. I mean, you should be doing a podcast, promote your books. His first time he finally did one was when he was still working for SI, and they said, you have to do a podcast. And then all of a sudden, like, Margot calls up, okay, Joe's got to do a podcast. Let's go over what we need to do.
And then she hates it because she has to edit the damn thing.
Yes, she does.
So she hates the podcast, right? Like, I know all this stuff. Yeah, and his episodes with Michael Schur are honestly some of the most entertaining just media you could ever listen to.
Joe is a really sharp guy. You do not ever want to play Trivial Pursuit with him, especially in the entertainment section. He will destroy you.
I can take. I could take him. I want to play Trivial. I want to play Trivial Pursuit with Joe Posnanski. How can we make this happen? He's also one of the only writers that I read with any regularity. So I weirdly feel like I know his kids. the stuff that they're up to. One of his daughters had a bad day at school the other day.
Yeah, the girls are really adorable. I haven't seen Joe in a couple of years now, so it's since he moved away. So it's sad. All right, we're here to talk about yours and not Joe's. So we'll, but yeah, check out the Poscast.
Yeah, does it exist right now?
I don't think he's had a new episode out in a while. It's been a while.
Yeah, he just needs to talk to Michael Schur about the World Series, and then I'll be happy again. And they can do a draft. God, those are so.
So you started one podcast, you ended it, you started a new one. What was some of the lessons you learned on launching the new one? Did you do anything special on the promotion side when you launched the new one, other than just to tell everyone from the old one that, hey, I've got the new one?
No, from a promotional standpoint, I didn't do anything different because it seemed to work the last time to just put out episodes and let it build on its own without trying to have a big launch party extravaganza.
So you're one of those annoying guys that just puts out good content and gets a really big audience and doesn't really work at it, the promotion side.
Yeah. Right. I have no marketing budget. I have no time for marketing budgets. But I just want to do the show.
So your advice then is just research, put out good content, edit so it sounds good.
The content is the whole thing. Focus on the content itself. Everything else is superfluous. Don't try to make flashy stuff and sell people on it and then have left yourself no time to actually give them a nice meal.
How much time do you think you put into your show per week with research? And you said you do an hour and a half of recording, but how much research and prep work do you do each week for your show?
So it took me about 3 months just to do the research for just to feel like I could get off the ground. And then during the week, I have 2 days a week that my son is at daycare. So that gives me about 9 or 10 hours I have to myself, which that's writing, that's reading, that's editing, recording. So that's 12 hours. No, we're talking 15 or 16 hours. And then when I am watching him during the week, I have 3 days that I'm a stay-at-home dad. I'll spend his nap times, which are supposed to be 3 hours, but they're slowly being whittled down to 2. So I got those 2 hours, 3 days a week. And then on Sundays, I will get the whole first half of the day to work. So, I'm 20, 25 hours a week. I think that I'm probably spending per episode.
That's a good amount of work into those episodes.
And then what I'm doing is right now, I'm writing the English Revolution stuff, but I'm reading for the American Revolution.
Oh, that's got to be confusing in your mind.
Yes, I compartmentalize actually very well, so I'm somehow able to pull this off. But yeah, right now I'm reading a book on the American Revolution and writing about the English Revolution.
I am looking forward to more revolutions in the future from you, and hearing what comes next in the British Revolution, and hear how Prince Rupert's fate turns out. He
lives a long and accomplished life.
Well, from what it sounded like so far, that's an amazing feat. So he does.
Yeah, it all works out really well for Rupert.
Not so much for Charles.
Not so much for Charles.
Mike, let people know where to find your podcast. But actually, both of them.
Oh, revolutionspodcast.com is where the Revolutions lives. And then the history of Rome.typepad.com is where the history of Rome lives. They are both on iTunes. They are in Stitcher. They are in various other places that have picked them up that I've had nothing to do with them being on those platforms. So look for it. Google it. I'm out there.
And remember, go back and listen from the beginning of History of Rome. Go and just do the download all, get them all, and then listen from the early all the way up. Well, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Mike for coming on the show. And folks, please check out both his podcasts, Revolutions, the current one. And once you're caught up there, go and check out the History of Rome podcast from the beginning and work your way through all the 180 plus episodes. If you're a history buff, you will really enjoy both shows. Links in the show notes to both, and that'll be to the links to them at iTunes. All right, now let's get into some podcasting news. First up, if you are a Libsyn podcaster and have a Halloween-themed episode coming up, please let Elsie know by sending an email to thefeed@libsyn.com, thefeed@libsyn.com, And you need to send your info before October 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, no exceptions. Look for the link titled Collaborative Halloween Episode from Libsyn in the show notes for episode 228 at podcast411.com. Okay, this past week saw Apple making some major updates to OS X, launching Mavericks and a brand new version of GarageBand and the Podcasts app. Let's go over some of the issues with each. First, I would say this to any podcaster on a Mac. Wait until late November, at least before updating to Mavericks, if you have not already. Because if you have, you may find you are having issues with, for example, the Alesis FireWire mixer and the drivers for it. And I'm sure there are other drivers for other FireWire and USB equipment that's not quite up to snuff yet. As a podcaster, it is always best to wait. Don't be the first one out the gate to update your OS. With GarageBand, if you do enhanced podcasts, you definitely don't want to update because it seems that the podcast track is gone in the new version of GarageBand, and there is no longer support for making enhanced podcasts. If you did upgrade, hopefully you kept the older version of GarageBand, which by default is kept, so you should still be able to launch the older version to do your enhanced podcasts. I'm not a big fan of enhanced podcasts. That said, I think it's a major oversight and a slap in the face to podcasters from Apple to remove this option. I hope they bring it back in the first update of the new GarageBand. Per what else does and does not work with GarageBand or the new version of GarageBand, I'll talk more about that in December, as I don't plan to upgrade to Mavericks until Thanksgiving weekend, and you have to upgrade to Mavericks to get the latest version of GarageBand. So I'm waiting until Thanksgiving weekend so I have all 4 days to get things working the way I need if I need those 4 days. My recommendation again is for you to wait to update until at least late November. Maybe even push it out to the week between Christmas and New Year's. That's if you're going to have off that time. But make sure you have some time off from work that you weren't planning on doing anything with to dedicate to getting your system up and running right after you upgrade to Mavericks. But if you did upgrade, remember the old version of GarageBand should still be on your computer. It should be archived in its own folder. Look for something like GarageBand 6.0.5 in your application folder. Look for a folder with that name. So no need to go out and get something new. Just know for enhanced podcasters, Apple, per the new GarageBand, is saying no soup for you. One update Apple did this past week that was positive was the update of the Podcast app for iOS, and one feature they added back for podcasters is that you can see the lyrics tag info again in the app. So when an episode is playing, you can see the show notes for that episode if the producer was kind enough to include those, like I do. So if you're listening to this episode in the new Podcast app, go to the episode play screen and tap on the artwork, and you will see the show notes, lyrics, tag, info show up for this episode. Sadly, it does not pull in the artwork for that episode. Oh well, little victories are better than major losses. The Podcast app also looks much nicer and has been redone to match iOS 7 feel. Now we just need to get Apple to install the Podcast app as a native app rather than having it bundled with the other free apps that you need to download after the fact. Still flummoxed about why Apple thinks the Podcast app, Find My iPhone, iBook, and a few others can't be pre-installed with the OS, like the stock calculator and weather and stock app are installed. Okay, probably a rant better served on Today in iOS. I guess the good news is there is still a podcast app, and Apple did not give up on podcasters like Google has. Just saying. Let's talk about some other issues podcasters on both sides of the Windows Mac aisles may be dealing with in December. Seems that the old public APIs Skype offered up are getting killed off in December. So if you are using an application on your computer that is specifically designed for recording Skype, it is likely that app will stop working in December. There are a couple of good discussions about this over on Google+. One from Matt Johnson has a bunch of really good info, as does the one started by Victoria Hansen. Links to both in the show notes for episode 228 at podcast411.com. If you are recording on your computer and using a generic solution that is just recording the audio running through your computer like Soundflower, you should be okay. For those longtime Podcast 411 listeners that took my advice on how to record Skype, this means nothing to you, as you are recording the correct way, off of your computer, onto a digital recorder, and your setup does not care about APIs and software updates. For those that are using something that is Skype specific to record, time to change, and now would be a good time to change to recording off of the computer. To see my setup, go to podcast411.com/mixer.pdf. That is, in my opinion, the very best way to record Skype calls. It is the most reliable way, it gives the best audio quality, and it is safe from updates and killed APIs. And it's what I used for today's interview as well. Again, podcast411.com/mixer.pdf if you'd like to see my setup. Okay, how about some good news, or at least a good tip? This has to do with how to reduce the size of your show-level artwork. As you may know, and has been mentioned on previous episodes, your artwork in iTunes now needs to be 1400 by 1400 pixels. It needs to be .png or .jpeg with RGB color, not CMYK. And it needs to be less than 500 kilobytes in file size if you want it to show up in iTunes all the time. Seems that last part, the less than 500 kilobytes, is not in Apple's actual specs, but is definitely something we have confirmed by seeing producers' artwork go missing in iTunes, and it being above the size and not showing back up until they lowered the file size to the less than 500 kilobytes. So this tip is per a question I get from producers all the time. How do you reduce the file size to less than 500 kilobytes? Well, I found a great site/resource for this. It is a post called How to Reduce the File Size of a PNG File. It has links to apps you can install on your computer, some for Mac, some for PC, and it has links to web services that will do this for you as well, like smushit.com, SMUSHIT.com. So if your artwork suddenly disappears from iTunes and you look and see your artwork is over 500 kilobytes in size, take a look at the link titled How to Reduce the File Size of a PNG File in the show notes for episode 228 at podcast411.com. Switching gears, an interesting little bug going on in iTunes right now. When submitting a new show, sometimes in the review screen, it is showing the wrong iTunes subcategory. For example, one show that had the issue had the main category in their feed as health and the subcategory as fitness and nutrition. And when they submitted to iTunes, iTunes showed their show in the health category, which was fine, but with the subcategory of sexuality. Now, I could probably talk about how fitness gets you to sexuality and keep the show G-rated, but if I tried to do that for nutrition, G ratings kind of go bye-bye real quick. Obviously, the producer was a little concerned on that, so make sure when submitting a new show, you check to see what iTunes is showing for the subcategory for the show before you hit accept. Apple is aware of the issue and is looking into it, but in the meantime, check your shows carefully before submitting. And this is not an issue on the producer side. Their feeds were definitely correct, so this is definitely an issue on the iTunes side. Little update with the EFF. The EFF has filed their petition for inter partes review of the podcasting patent that was awarded to Personal Audio and is being used by podcast terrorist Jim Logan to try to extort money from podcasters. Thankfully, the EFF is on the side of the podcasters, and they were able to find some really good examples of prior art that the USPTO should have found on their own before issuing this patent. So now for the EFF, with the support of podcasters like me, donated back to them back in the spring, and many of you that also donated to them in the spring, they have now paid that ridiculously high filing fee so that the USPTO can see the error of their ways and then remove the hammer from Jim Logan's hand that he's been going about smacking podcasters in the head with for this year, since early this year. This is sadly going to be an 18-month process before said hammer is removed from the podcast terrorist's hands. Expect in the meantime for him to send out more threatening letters trying to shake down podcasters for money. If you get that letter, do not call the number on the letter. If you need to call someone, call your own lawyer. Interesting little fact from the EFF that they shared when I was at the LA Podfest. When looking at situations like this, where a patent troll carpet bombs with extortion letters, Those that just threw away the letters and did nothing, on average, they paid out the least. Those that called the number on the letters or contacted the person that sent the letter in some way or shape or form and let them know they received the letter, they paid the most. Now, neither I or the EFF is quote unquote recommending that you throw said letter away, just stating what has been seen in the past. Now, some might think calling Jim a podcast terrorist is extreme. Actually, what I want to call him, I can't because I try to keep the show G-rated. As we get more info from the EFF on this, I will pass it along. I want to send a thanks out to all the people that ran the LA Podfest, all the volunteers and the organizers. It was a really great event. If you were there, it was great meeting you. For those that didn't go, it really was a great event. If you're really into podcasts, the comedy podcasts, it's definitely an event you should check out, especially if you're in the LA area. There were some good sessions too. I was on a panel on how to podcast, basically talking about some of the tech part of it and how to monetize a podcast. Hopefully they'll make those sessions available online. I have to check with them. Maybe next episode I'll have links. I'll mention it on the next one. Now, the next big event that's coming up is the New Media Expo, and that's going to be in Las Vegas. That's going to be the first weekend in 2014 in Las Vegas in January. Please, 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 if you are available to come to this. This is the national event for podcasters. You want to meet other podcasters, you want to get advice, you want to talk, you want to see what's available, just mingle, be with your brethren. This is the event to go to. There really is no other national event for podcasters like the New Media Expo. And this is for any genre podcast, a techie, if you're a techie podcast, even more so, because after it ends, then CES is there and you can stick around for a couple days and check out CES. But more importantly, as a podcaster, it's just nice to see and get some advice from other podcasters who are there. And more importantly, to network and get word out about your podcast to other podcasters. So hopefully you will be able to make it to the New Media Expo in Las Vegas in January. Libsyn will be there. I'll be there with Libsyn. I'll be there speaking again. I've been to every one of the Blog World New Media Expos, and they just keep getting better year in, year out. And this year, it looks like there'll be even more podcasters there. So hope to see you there. If you are going to be going there and you are a Libsyn podcaster, or even if you're not going and you're a Libsyn podcaster, and you have some print materials, business cards or small 4x6 type cards about your show that you would like for us to hand out at the Libsyn booth, we would be more than happy to do that. So just send an email to me at rob@libsyn.com about that. And if you're going to be there, it's even better. Just bring them by me, and I will put them up at the booth. And if you want to set up times to meet people or have a giveaway at the Libsyn booth, please let us know. We're going to try to dedicate about half of the booth space to our listeners. So anything you want to bring by, if you got a banner, a little poster, anything, we'd love to put it up at the booth for your show if you're hosting with Libsyn. Again, send that to rob@libsyn.com, and we'll be talking more about this on the feed. So make sure you're subscribed to the feed if you're a Libsyn podcaster, and we'll be talking more about what we're going to be doing at the New Media Expo in future episodes of the feed. I saw a really good product review for the Rode smartLav, a $60 mic versus the $600 Sennheiser mic over on YouTube. They were looking at different lavalier mics, wireless lav mics. Look for the link in the show notes titled Rode, R-O-D-E, smartLav, and it's YouTube. And check out that video. I think sometimes people get too caught up in recommending high dollar mics, and it's nice to see a good review for a very reasonably priced mic. Like I always say, if you spent over $200 on a mic, you spent way too much. One more article item to talk about. It is a post titled, "Is Podcasting Dead?" It is from Marcus Allen. Not really sure who that is. All I know is that I'm not going to even link to it, as he does not even have the common courtesy to turn comments on. And well, his article is that written by someone who's basically an idiot when it comes to podcasting. Sorry to be so blunt. I know, say only good things about people, yada yada. But it is dumb posts like this that tick me off. And really what his complaint is that he could not grow an audience, so podcasting is dead. As if he is the end all. That's the kind of bit of hubris. Anyway, worse than that is the following quote from the article. "I launched a new podcast, answering questions on the fly live. I invested a ton of time on the launch, and now I have a big email list alert, and I thought I'd easily get 500 people to listen in. Instead, just 22 showed up and just 72 listened to the replay so far. Needless to say, I killed my podcast after just one broadcast." Unquote. Newsflash, people for the most part don't like listening to live events. They don't want to be told when they have to listen and where. They like listening after the fact. And killing a show after one episode shows a complete lack of commitment and respect for your audience. No wonder you didn't have an audience. They already knew you didn't respect them. Wow. He ends the article with, quote, "Is podcasting dead? As a listener, I love podcasting and most of my education about life comes from it. But as a content producer, podcasting is sadly a dying broadcast vehicle," unquote. To which I would have commented on his post if comments were opened, "No, podcasting is not a dying medium. You just suck at it. Don't try to blame a medium on your shortcomings. Some people will do great, others not so much. But just because podcasting is not working out for you doesn't mean it's a dying medium for all. Podcasting audiences continue to grow overall. We see it growing at Libsyn, and I hear it from the folks at Apple. Granted, I would like to see more support from Apple with regards to podcasts and the latest versions of GarageBand, and I would like to see the podcast app be native, but at least Apple continues to update and put resources into the podcast app. As smartphones continue to grow, as we see more and more people getting them, podcast future continues to grow and continues to be very bright. With already over 55% of downloads going directly to mobile devices, that was for September, versus just 42% to mobile devices 18 months ago, it's rather clear where podcasting's future is, and that's with mobile, but not live. Podcasting is definitely a growing broadcast vehicle, which along the way will have a few underachievers like Marcus Allen falling off that vehicle as it continues to speed up. Just saying. And on that note, as always, if you have any feedback, give us a call, 206-666-4357, 206-MOM-HELP, or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. Till the next time, I'm your host, Rob, from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different. This podcast is proudly hosted on Libsyn.com. If you'd like to learn more about podcast hosting, go to Libsyn.com. That's Libsyn.com, as in Liberated Syndication, to find out more about podcast hosting, podcast monetization, podcast promotion through smartphone apps, as in iOS, Android, Windows Phone, and Windows Phone 8 as well, plus many other features, including unpublished to Facebook, Blogger, WordPress, and Twitter. Go to Libsyn.com. And if you use promo code podcast411 when you sign up, you get the rest of this month free and all of next month free.